Oh, the grand old houses of England. They do have their secrets, don't they? This one, Hemlock Grange, positively creaked with them. Its current mistress, a Mrs. Elara Higgins, was a woman of particular tastes. Refined, you see, always perfectly coiffed, her voice like wind chimes. Deceptively so. Tonight she was expecting company, a rather select gathering. For dinner, the main course. Well, that was currently residing in the pantry. A young lad named Timmy, small for his age, perhaps 10 years, but with eyes that held an old spark. He was, to put it mildly, in a spot of bother. A dreadful pickle, you might say. The pantry itself was a grand affair. Stone flags on the floor, cold as a tomb. Shelves groaning with jars of peculiar preserves. Pickled newts, I shouldn't wonder. And worse. The air hummed with a strange energy. A low thrum, like a monstrous cat purring. Timmy sat on an upturned crate. He could hear Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen, the clang of an enormous pot, the hiss of a fire being stoked with unnatural vigour. The scent of herbs drifted under the door, not parsley, sage, rosemary or thyme. Oh no, something far more exotic and unsettling, something that smelled faintly of graveyards and regret. Mrs. Higgins hummed a jaunty yet discordant little tune, a tune that promised no good for young Timothy. "Almost ready, my dears," she'd call out, as if her guests were already in the drawing room, sipping sherry. But her only audience was the whispering shadows and the boy in the pantry. She was preparing a feast, a Samhain celebration, a little out of season. But who was Timmy to question her calendar? He knew with a chilling certainty that boy pie was a distinct possibility on her menu. He had to think, and think fast, his small hands clenched. The old clock in the hall chimed the half-hour. Tick-tock, time was running out. He pressed his ear to the heavy oak door. The sounds were becoming more purposeful, the rhythmic chop-chop-chop of a very large cleaver, the bubbling of a very large cauldron. Mrs. Higgins, he knew, was a stickler for tradition. Her fellow witches would expect only the best. And tonight Timmy was slated to be the piece de resistance. A shiver ran down his spine, colder than the stone floor beneath him. But in that shiver, a tiny spark of an idea began to glow. A desperate, audacious idea. He was small, yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, he was cleverer than she imagined. He had to be. The key turned in the lock, a grating, rusty sound. The sound of impending doom. The pantry door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Higgins. She filled the doorway, a benevolent smile playing on her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes, you see, were like chips of obsidian. "Timothy, my sweet," she cooed, her voice smooth as silk. "It's almost time. The water is just coming to a rolling boil." She wiped her hands on a surprisingly clean apron, an apron embroidered with what looked suspiciously like tiny bones. "Come along now, there's a good lad." She beckoned with a long, elegant finger. Timmy stood up, his heart thumping like a drum in a madman's parade. He swallowed hard. "Mrs. Higgins, ma'am," he began, his voice a little shaky but clear. Before we proceed, might I offer a story to pass the time? And perhaps," he added with a sudden inspiration, "to whet your appetite. A good story can make any meal more palatable." He tried to look innocent, a difficult task given the circumstances, but he gave it his best shot, a little quaver in the voice, a hopeful glint in the eye. He was playing for time. Precious, precious time. Mrs. Higgins paused, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in amusement. "A story, you say?" She tapped a thoughtful finger against her chin. "How quaint, and from such a tender morsel." A faint, dry chuckle escaped her. "I confess I do enjoy a good narrative, especially one with a bit of spice." She considered him, her head tilted. The fire in the kitchen roared, a hungry sound. "Very well, boy. Amuse me, but make it a good one. My patience, like my cauldron, is not bottomless." She gestured for him to begin, a flicker of genuine curiosity in her dark eyes. "Oh, it's a good one, ma'am," Timmy assured her, relief washing over him in a tiny wave. He cleared his throat. "It's called The Tale of Crow's Haunt Mill." A dreadfully gloomy place it was, out on the fens where the mist clings like a shroud. He set the scene with a shiver, his voice gaining a little confidence. He needed to capture her imagination, to draw her in, to make her forget, just for a moment, the bubbling pot and the waiting cleaver. It concerns a young man, an artist, who inherited this very mill, a Mr. Silas Blackwood. He thought it a bargain. Oh, he was dreadfully mistaken. Mr. Silas Blackwood, Timmy continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, arrived at Crow's Haunt Mill on a bleak autumn afternoon. The sky was the colour of lead. The wind whispered through the broken slats of the sails, a mournful sound, like an old man sighing his last. The mill itself stood gaunt and silent. Locals in the nearby village of Witherdene had warned him, of course. They spoke of old man Hemlock, the previous miller, a recluse, a dabbler in things best left undabbled. They said the mill was hungry. Timmy paused, letting the word hang in the air. Mrs. Higgins watched him, her expression unreadable. Silas, being a practical sort, dismissed their tales as rustic superstition. He was an artist, you see. He saw only atmosphere, inspiration. He set up his easel. He began to paint. But the mill began to work on him. At night he'd hear it, a faint grinding, stone on stone, even though the sails were still, even though the mechanism was rusted solid. A cold dread would fill his small bedchamber, the scent of old grain and something else, something earthy and ancient. Timmy lowered his voice, drawing Mrs. Higgins closer, metaphorically speaking. He could almost hear the distant creak of the imaginary mill. He found an old journal, Timmy went on, his eyes wide, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, penned by Hemlock himself. It spoke not of grinding grain, but of grinding spirit. The mill wasn't just a structure, Mum. It was alive, or perhaps possessed by something that had seeped from the fen itself. It needed a miller. It fed on their essence, drawing them in, making them part of its unholy workings. Hemlock hadn't died. He'd been absorbed. The air in the pantry seemed to grow colder. Mrs. Higgins leaned forward, ever so slightly. Silas, terrified, tried to flee, but the mill wouldn't let him. Doors slammed shut. Windows refused to open. The grinding sound grew louder, more insistent. It was in his head. He tried to set fire to the wretched place, but the flames sputtered and died, as if smothered by an unseen hand. And then, the twist, Mrs. Higgins, the truly awful part. Timmy leaned in conspiratorially. He wasn't fighting the mill, he the mill, or becoming it. His will was no longer his own. The final entry in his own diary, found years later by another unfortunate soul, simply read, "The grain is fine this year, the stones turn smoothly." He had become the new miller, forever bound, forever grinding. Mrs. Higgins actually shivered, a delicate, almost imperceptible tremor. My, she murmured, a strange light in her eyes. "Quite the chilling concoction, young Timothy. A hungry mill, you say? How resourceful." She tapped her foot, a sharp, impatient sound on the stone floor. The spell was broken, but a sliver of interest remained. "Amusing. But the hour grows late, boy. My guests will be arriving soon, and they do so dislike having to wait for the centerpiece." She gestured again towards the kitchen, where the bubbling had taken on a more vigorous, almost eager rhythm. The scent of strange spices intensified. Timmy's mind raced. He needed another story, quickly. "But madam," he ventured, his voice laced with a carefully crafted urgency, that was merely an appetizer for the imagination. The next tale is far more unsettling. It concerns a gentle botanist, a Mr. Peregrine Petalwick, a man who loved flowers, perhaps a little too much." He watched her face. Was that a flicker of botanical interest? Witches, he recalled from some dimly remembered book, often had a keen interest in herbs and plants. Perhaps this angle would work. He had to try. Mr. Petalwick, Timmy elaborated, painting a picture of idyllic village life, a stark contrast to the grim mill. Lived in the charming village of Little Wispingham, known for its prize-winning roses and its rather eccentric vicar. Mr. Petalwick was the mildest of men, content with his greenhouse, his collection of rare ferns, and a good cup of Darjeeling tea, until, that is, he discovered a new bloom. Deep in the gloaming woods, a place where even the birds seemed to sing in a minor key. He hoped the contrast would pique her curiosity further, delaying the inevitable march to the cauldron. "An orchid it was," Timmy said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, of a colour never before seen. A deep velvet purple with veins of startling crimson. It seemed to pulse, gently. He brought it back to his greenhouse, of course. He was terribly excited. He named it Petalwick's Enigma. He tended it with loving care. He didn't notice at first the way the other plants in the greenhouse seemed to shrink away from it, or the faint, sweet, cloying scent it released at dusk. Mrs. Higgins sniffed the air as if trying to catch that imaginary scent. Good. He had her attention again, for now. The trouble began subtly, Timmy continued, his voice soft and ominous like rustling leaves in a graveyard. A small scratch, it was. Mr. Petalwick pricked his finger on a thorn whilst repotting his prized enigma. A mere trifle. He thought nothing of it. Wiped away the single drop of blood. But the orchid, it seemed, thought rather more of it. That night Mr. Petalwick felt restless. He dreamt of rich, dark earth, of cool rain on his skin. He woke with an unusual craving for damp soil and dewdrops. Timmy glanced at Mrs. Higgins. Her expression was one of rapt attention, a hint of professional interest in her gaze. Then came the changes, Timmy said, leaning forward slightly. A faint greenish tinge to his complexion. His fingernails, they thickened, curled, almost like roots. He felt a strange lassitude during the day, but at night, under the moonlight filtering through his greenhouse glass, he felt an odd vitality. He started talking to the enigma, whispering to it, and he swore sometimes it whispered back. Not in words, of course, but in feelings, images of spreading, growing, blooming. He paused for effect, letting the image sink in. The kitchen noises seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the imagined rustle of sentient leaves. His skin grew rough, like bark in places, Timmy elaborated, his voice filled with a feigned pity. Tiny green shoots, delicate little leaves began to sprout from his fingertips, from his ears. He tried to hide it naturally, wore gloves, high collars, but the transformation was relentless. He was becoming a plant man, more plant than man eventually. His movements slowed, his speech became thick, rustling. The villagers of Little Wispingham, they were kind at first, then frightened, terribly frightened. They brought him water. They tried to prune him. He shuddered dramatically. But the twist, Mrs. Higgins, the truly ghastly part, Timmy whispered, was that Mr. Petalwick wasn't just turning into any old plant. He was becoming another Petalwick's enigma, rooted to the spot in his own beloved greenhouse. His eyes, now wide and unblinking like dark blossoms, his limbs, branches, and the original orchid, it thrived, larger and more vibrant than ever, drawing sustenance from him. He became a horrifyingly beautiful statue, a human topiary, silently calling with a scent of irresistible sweetness for others to come and admire the flowers, and perhaps join the collection. Mrs. Higgins let out a slow breath. Fascinating, she breathed. Utterly fascinating. The spell of the story lingered for a moment, a fragile thing. Then Mrs. Higgins blinked. Her practical, culinary nature reasserted itself. Remarkable boy, truly, such botanical ingenuity. She glanced towards the kitchen. The bubbling was now a frantic, hungry sound. A plume of oddly coloured steam curled under the scullery door, but inspiration must alas give way to perspiration. And ingestion. Her smile returned, thin as a razor's edge. My cauldron, Timothy. It beckons, and my guests, I fear, are not partial to vegetarian options for the main course, however, creatively rendered. Timmy's heart sank. He was running out of tales, running out of time. Desperation clawed at him. "Oh, but madam!" he cried, a tremor of genuine fear in his voice this time, which he quickly tried to mask with enthusiasm. "There is one more, just one, and it is by far the most perplexing. It concerns a mirror, Mrs. Higgins, a grand silvered looking-glass, in a house not unlike this one, perhaps. Penumbra Hall, it was called, a place of shadows and secrets. He hoped the mention of a grand house would resonate with her own abode. He had to try something, anything. A mirror? Mrs. Higgins paused, her hand midway to the doorknob. There was a certain vanity about it, Timmy had noticed, the way she always checked her reflection in the polished copper pot. Perhaps this would strike a chord. A deceptive looking-glass, you said. A flicker of interest. Yes, it was there. Mirrors can be such revealing things, or concealing. Do tell, boy. but make it swift. My broth will reduce to a mere stock if we tarry much longer." She settled back just a fraction against the door jamb. A small victory. "Penumbra Hall," Timmy began, his voice hushed, "was inherited by a young lady of great beauty and little fortune, Lady Annalise. The hall was grand, decaying, filled with dust sheets like mournful ghosts, and in the master bedchamber there stood the mirror, tall as a man, framed in tarnished silver, depicting strange, coiling serpents. It was said to have been in the family for generations. Annalise was warned, of course. Old retainers whispered of its influence, of people who stared too long and were changed. He glanced at Mrs. Higgins. Her eyes were fixed on him, a dark, knowing gleam within them. He had hooked her again. Lady Annalise, being young and somewhat headstrong, Timmy continued, weaving his narrative spell, paid little heed to such old wives' tales. She was rather taken with the mirror. It had a certain allure. The first time she looked into it, truly looked, she saw not her own reflection, but that of another woman. A woman of ethereal beauty, pale as moonlight, with eyes like shadowed pools. This woman smiled, a slow, inviting smile, and beckoned, just a subtle movement of a slender hand. Annalise was captivated, mesmerized. Timmy watched Mrs. Higgins. Her gaze was distant, as if seeing that very mirror in her mind's eye. She began to spend hours before the silvered glass, Timmy narrated, his voice dropping to a whisper. She would talk to the woman, pour out her hopes, her fears. The woman in the mirror never spoke, but she listened, or so it seemed. And Annalise began to change. She grew pale, listless. Her own beauty seemed to fade, as if the mirror were drinking it in. Her maids grew concerned. They said the room was always cold, that a faint scent of lilies, funeral lilies, clung to the air around the glass. He made sure to add the sensory details, the little touches that made a story breathe, or in this case, gasp. The truth, Mrs. Higgins, was far more sinister than a mere haunting, Timmy revealed, leaning in as if sharing a dreadful secret. The woman in the mirror was not a ghost trapped within. Oh no, she the mirror. Or rather, an entity bound to it, a creature that fed on vanity, on life force, on the very soul of whoever gazed too long. It didn't want to share its prison. It wanted to swap, to trade its cold, reflected existence for a warm, breathing life. And Lady Annalise, in her loneliness and fascination, was becoming the perfect vessel. The silence in the pantry was thick enough to spread on toast. Even the bubbling from the kitchen seemed momentarily subdued. The entity grew stronger as Annalise grew weaker, Timmy explained, his voice barely audible. One stormy night, as lightning flashed, illuminating the room, the woman in the mirror reached out. Her hand, no longer a mere reflection, began to pass through the silvered surface. Cold as ice. Annalise felt a tug, a dreadful pulling sensation, as if her very spirit were being drawn from her body into the cold embrace of the glass. The swap was about to happen. But then, the twist. At the very last moment, Annalise, with a final surge of will, remembered a small silver hand mirror on her dressing table. She grabbed it and held it up to the larger mirror. "Reflecting the reflection," Timmy exclaimed, making a sharp gesture. The entity in the great mirror, confronted with its own image in the small one, recoiled. It shrieked, a sound like shattering glass and winter wind. Its own illusion, its own power, turned back upon itself. It was stunned, disoriented, its spectral hand retreating back into the silvered depths. Lady Annalise, though terribly weakened, had broken the connection. She had the great mirror dragged from the room, covered in heavy velvet, and locked away in the deepest, darkest vault of Penumbra Hall, lined with lead, for good measure. Timmy paused, taking a deep breath. He'd given it his all. Mrs. Higgins was silent for a long moment. A faint frown creased her brow. A clever trick, she conceded, her voice a low murmur, using its own nature against it. Ingenious. Then she straightened up, her eyes regaining their sharp, predatory focus. A most diverting trilogy of tales, Timothy. You have a talent. A pity it will be wasted. She opened the pantry door fully. But the time for stories is over. My guests will be here at any moment, and the main course simply be ready. She gestured decisively towards the kitchen, where the cauldron bubbled with renewed, ominous vigor. Into the pot with you, boy. This was it, the moment of truth. Timmy's mind raced. He had one last desperate gamble. "But Mrs. Higgins!" he cried, feigning a sudden, brilliant idea. "That last story, the reflection, it's given me a thought. For the seasoning, for the of the broth." He tried to look earnest, helpful even. "Have you ever considered reflecting the flavour? To concentrate its essence?" He waved his hands vaguely, as if trying to grasp a complex culinary concept. He hoped his babbling sounded like a flash of inspiration, rather than pure, unadulterated panic. He needed her to get close to that pot. Reflecting the flavour? Mrs. Higgins paused, 1 foot over the threshold, her brow furrowed in genuine, if suspicious, curiosity. Witches, Timmy reasoned, were always looking for new and improved methods for their craft. "What nonsense is this, boy? Speak plainly." But there was a hint of interest. "I know all the traditional methods, of course. Eye of newt, toe of frog, the usual. But reflecting flavour, that's novel." She took a step towards the huge steaming cauldron that dominated the centre of her vast, shadowy kitchen. The air was thick with steam, and the scent of unidentifiable and frankly alarming ingredients. "Well, it's a rather obscure technique, ma'am," Timmy improvised, walking slowly towards the enormous bubbling cauldron, Mrs. Higgins following, intrigued despite herself. "You see, certain rare herbs like the moon petal bloom or the shadow root, their full potency is only released when they perceive their own essence. You need to show them to themselves, as it were, in the simmering brew." He pointed towards the cauldron. "If you just hold a reflective surface, say, your silver ladle, over the steam and look the reflection within the broth, it intensifies everything, makes it unforgettable." He hoped he sounded convincing. It was all utter tosh, of course. Mrs. Higgins, ever the culinary experimentalist where dark arts were concerned, peered at her cauldron. "Moon petal bloom, you say? Shadow root," she mused. "I have some shadow root, but I've always just tossed it in." She picked up a large, beautifully polished silver ladle. "Reflect its essence, you say?" She leaned precariously over the steaming, turbulent surface of the brew, holding the ladle above it, trying to catch a glimpse of something in the roiling concoction. Her face was intent. Her balance, however, was compromised. It was now or never for young Timmy. He edged closer to a pile of firewood, stacked neatly beside the enormous hearth. With a deep breath and a silent apology to firewood everywhere, Timmy gave a sturdy log a sharp, well-aimed kick. It skittered across the flagstone floor and connected squarely with Mrs. Higgins's ankles. "Oh!" she cried, a most unwitch-like sound of surprise. Her arms flailed. The silver ladle flew through the air, and Mrs. Elara Higgins, purveyor of peculiar pies and connoisseur of culinary cruelty, toppled forward with a tremendous splash right into her own bubbling, superheated cauldron. There was a brief, furious sizzling, a single indignant shriek that was quickly gurgled into silence, and then just the merry bubbling of the pot. Timmy stared at the cauldron for a moment, wisps of steam carrying a slightly charred, surprisingly sweet aroma. "Well," he said to the empty kitchen, "I suppose she's stewing in her own juices now. A bit overdone, I should think." He dusted off his hands. His gaze fell upon a biscuit tin on the dresser. Mrs. Higgins's special reserve, no doubt. He hopped up, prized it open, and selected a large, jam-filled biscuit. A jammy dodger, if I'm not mistaken. He took a defiant bite. Then he turned, just for a moment, as if to an unseen audience. He gave a cheeky wink. "Always best to leave a party on a high note, wouldn't you agree? Ta-ta for now." And out the kitchen door he scampered, into the cool, cleansing night. Oh yes, a most satisfactory conclusion.